The story that was told in the previous lesson about Rebbe Wolf and the letter that he sent is also connected to another thing which is considered a major accomplishment of the Alter Rebbe. And that is that the Alter Rebbe was very influential that people from Vitebsk and surrounding areas should move into Russia, into the part of Russia near the border. And actually this began in the year Tov Kuf Lamed Beis, which is 1772. But this is something which is considered very significant and a tremendous accomplishment of the Alter Rebbe. To explain this, we'll give a little bit of background. In general, the border between Russia and Poland was closed. No one is allowed to come in to Russia. And during the time of the Alter Rebbe, it was only about 30 years or something that they allowed the borders to be open for businessmen. In Russia, they allowed that businessmen from Poland and from Germany would be allowed to come into Russia to exchange business during the Yurid. Yurid is a fair. These things took place twice a year, 2 months during the summer and 2 months during the winter. And during this time, the businessmen would travel back and forth, but otherwise the border was closed and with a very tight security that nobody should be able to come in. However, we find that a number of Jewish families did come into Russia and settle there. The reason for this was twofold. First of all, the noblemen in Russia, they themselves were not educated. They had no general knowledge. There were many of them that didn't even know how to read and didn't know how to write. Many of them didn't even know how to sign their name. But generally speaking, they were decent people, and they dealt with people in a decent way. They weren't even aware that a lot of the people that they appointed them to be managers of their estates, that they dealt very harshly with their workers. Because when they would come to visit their estates, rather than investigating how the business was running, they would get involved in hunting and other sports, just having a good time. When they did pay attention to how the business was going, and they discovered that the managers were cruel to the workers, in many cases they would punish the managers, and in some cases they would fire them completely. These noblemen, however, were very friendly with a lot of Jewish people. And this was because when they would meet by these fairs that took place twice a year, they would buy expensive things. They would buy diamonds and gems and pearls. They would buy golden and silver vessels. They would buy glass vessels and other materials which most of the craftsmen, most of the people behind it were Jews. They were the ones who had the skills and used to do this and sell this. So they got to know a lot of the Jewish people. As a result of that, they many times invited some of these businessmen that they dealt with that they should move over to live in Russia. And because of their position, they were able to give them this permit to be able to come across the border. So in that way, quite a number of Jewish families settled in Russia, but most of them settled in the big cities. And unfortunately, gradually, they got further and further away from Torah study and from leading a true God-fearing life, because the Jewish families were very few, and they were surrounded by non-Jews. Also, other people that came across the border, and these were Jews who lived near the border and find it very hard with their livelihood and had a desire to come across the border, they would pay the guards. Some of them would plead with them, and some of these guards would just happen to be nice to them and allow them to come across. These people who came across were mostly people who had skill like tailors, shoemakers, carpenters, and a lot of them came across the border. It definitely improved their economic, their financial situation, but unfortunately their ruchnizik situation, spiritually, they went down. The reason being that a lot of these people, they were simple Yidden, Anashim Pshutim, and before, when they lived in Poland, they were part of a community, and in the community they were part of certain groups. They had these clubs. There was a group called Chevet Poilei Tzedek. There was a group called Chevet Mashkimei Kum, Chevet Tilim. So they belonged to a group. Those who lived in the big cities were members of a shul, and the shul also was identified with the kind of work that they did. There were shuls that were called the shuls of the tailors, the shuls of the bakers, the shul of the shoemakers. So everyone found their little place. And they came to the shul. They davened 3 times a day. They heard a shir every day between Mincha and Ma'ariv, usually in Agoda, in the Medrash. On Shabbat they would hear a shir in the Parsha of the week, or in the Medrash, pertaining to the Parsha of the week. So although they were simple Jews, and their knowledge of Torah was very limited, nevertheless they were God-fearing Jews, and they observed Torah mitzvahs properly. But when they moved over to Russia, these groups broke apart, and in many of the places where they came, they were just a few Jewish families living between hundreds and sometimes thousands of non-Jewish families. And slowly, gradually, their spiritual situation deteriorated. A lot of them began to be more lenient in mitzvahs. They began to conduct themselves like other citizens, just not to be different. And especially, this affected their children. The boys and girls, the young children that were born in Russia, they grew up together with the non-Jewish children. They had no education, nobody guiding them, nobody teaching them. And at least those who went into Russia in the big cities still had something. There was a shul there. There was perhaps a Rav, a Malamed, but in the small cities, they usually had one person. That one person was the Sheikhet, he was the Chazan, he was the Balkeda, he was the Malamed, and it was very difficult for him to influence all these children. But those who lived yet in the villages, they really had nothing. And their children grew up without Torah, and many times these children grew up, even at the age of Bar Mitzvah, they couldn't even read. The first one to interest himself in the life of these Jewish families was the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe sent shluchim, special messengers there, to visit these Jewish families and to organize for them a shir where they'd be able to study together. For the adults, he made sure they had shirim in Chumash, in Mishnah, and in Gemara, in Medrash or Agoda. And for the young children, the Alter Rebbe organized a cheder where the little children could learn what they have to learn. And this was necessary because these Jewish families were so isolated from the rest of the Yidden. At that time, most of the Jewish people lived in Poland, a little bit less in Lithuania. But in Russia, there was just these isolated families scattered here and there, and they didn't have any support system, so to speak, to hold on to their Yiddishkeit. One time, however, something happened that the activities of the Alter Rebbe to strengthen and to influence Yiddishkeit in these communities took on a much stronger approach. There was a chassid of the Alter Rebbe, whose name is Rabbi Yechanan Zev Haradaka. He was from the city of Haraduk. He was a very big chassid, phenomenal Torah scholar. He knew by heart many Masechtas with the Rashi and the Tosfos. He had a broad knowledge in Chassidus, and more than anything else, he was a chassid that worked with himself to refine himself, to refine his personality in the Chassidic way of life. And he was a Baal Midas, a man who had a very good heart and had very good attributes. His livelihood was from traveling from city to city, from village to village, selling different merchandise. Many times he would meet and come to the courtyards of the noblemen, and he had a very good parnasa. He used to bring in a lot of money, and he would usually give a substantial amount of money from his earnings to the Alter Rebbe for tzedakah. One time when he came to the Alter Rebbe said to him that he should do something in business different than he usually does. Alter Rebbe said to him, I want you to go over the border and go into Russia and do business in Russia. And it was a known fact for the Jews in those times that Russia was not like Poland. And unfortunately, Jewish life and the Jewish people there were much more coarse, further away from Yiddishkeit. But being that the Alter Rebbe told him to go there, he went. And Rabbi Yechon Zev found that this trip was a very depressing trip. Before, when he traveled to places like Vitebsk, Haradok, and cities in the nearby area, he would always meet Yidden. He would meet them in the villages. He would meet them in the inns that were on the way. When he had to stay over someplace, he would stay over and be able to study Torah. Many times he would meet people who were also educated in Torah. Many times he would meet Chassidim. And for Shabbos, he always made it a point to be home for Shabbos. And if he couldn't get to be home for Shabbos, he stayed by his family, which was a chassid. This time, for about 5 months, until Shavuos, he was traveling in an area where most of the people were, Jewish people there were ignorant of Torah. Many of them were actually illiterate. Many of them were so coarse they looked and dressed and acted no different than the Russian peasants that lived around them. When he came back to the Alter Rebbe after this trip, he brought with him a lot more money for tzedakah from his earnings. In fact, from this trip, he earned 5 times as much as he earns when he goes on the trip in Poland. But he came back to the Alter Rebbe and he was very broken. In fact, he broke down crying and he said to the Alter Rebbe that it was very depressing to be in these circles between such people. And he's begging the Alter Rebbe to allow him to go back to do his business in those areas which are Jewish areas. The Alter Rebbe said to him, Hashem mitzadi geber keinanu v'darka yechpot, which means Hashem is the one that prepares the path of a person, and he goes in that path that Hashem wants him to go. That there's a certain mission that Hashem has that has to be completed. And therefore the Alter Rebbe concluded, who is a person that he should say, this I do want to do, and this I don't want to do. In other words, the Alter Rebbe made it very clear to him that his mission is to travel in these areas. So that year, after Sukkot, Rabbi Yechon Zev went once again beyond the border, went into Russia. And because it was a very cold weather and there's a lot of snow, he had no choice. And in certain places he had to stay there for more than 2 weeks, just to wait till the snow came down so he can continue to travel. The Yidden who he stayed by were free, they had no work to do, so they got into discussions. And he began to talk to them about Yiddishkeit, he began to teach them Torah, and he began to make them aware of certain ways of life that are more appropriate for a Jew, and he was very successful. In fact, at the end of that winter, he actually had accomplished and succeeded in bringing quite a few families to become Baalei Teshuva. When he returned to the Alter Rebbe this time, he came and he was actually very happy and very excited. And he gave it, the money that he gave to the Alter Rebbe for tzedakah, the Alter Rebbe said should be used for the expenses necessary that people should go out to these families and teach them Torah. So after Pesach, the Alter Rebbe called in a few of the Chassidim, and he sent them on shlichus to these areas, to these cities, and these villages where this Chassid of Yechanan Zev visited. And he appointed Rabbi Yechanan Zev to be in charge, that send out these people, and some of them should become Rabbanim there. There should be people who will shecht, Malamdim, who will teach the young children, establish yeshivas, establish shuls, mikvahs, and other institutions of tzedakah that a normal Jewish community is supposed to have. After 3 years passed, it was not to recognize these communities. They had the Narbonim that they needed, the Molamdim, shuls, and mikvahs, and everything. And from year to year, this grew. The Alter Rebbe sent shluchim to these places, and they were the spiritual influence in all these communities. And after many years, the communities there were just like any other Jewish community, and the way a Jewish community should look. So in fact, in the year Tavkuf Nun Daled, 1794, that is when officially Russia opened its borders. And many people came over to Russia to settle there. There were a lot of Jews who also came, Jews from Lithuania, who were Torah scholars, and they had a Torah background. So these Jews came, settled in Russia. They expected to find so-called wasteland, and they were shocked to find cities, shtetlach, and villages that had everything that a Jewish community should have. There were yeshivas, there were malamdim, there were people who had shiurim, and they discovered that this was all through the efforts of the Alter Rebbe. He was the one that sent shluchim there. And when they met the Chassidim and what they accomplished, they were amazed. And this was in total contradiction to everything they heard about Chassidim before. And these families wrote letters back home to Lithuania telling them that we see now that all the judgments that came out against Chassidim were false. And they were based on misleading information. And seemingly the Bezdin didn't do enough research before they came out with their verdict. And they reprimanded them for not doing a better investigation. One of the people who moved over to Russia was this Reb Zunul Wolf we spoke about before. And that's how he was exposed to Chassidim. He found out that there was Chassidim there, saw how great Torah scholars they are, how they're God-fearing Jews, and he realized that tremendous injustice was done towards these people, and that's when he wrote his letter. This is actually an interesting thing that we see here, that many people are not familiar with this, that the Alter Rebbe sent shluchim all over Russia, Lithuania, to teach Chassidus. That is common knowledge. And the Alter Rebbe sent Chassidim all over to teach Chassidus, and that's how many people became Chassidim. But many people are not familiar with this work of the Alter Rebbe, that he actually sent shluchim to different parts of Russia, to communities that were alienated from Yiddishkeit, and through these shluchim they became Balei Tshuva, and this is all through the efforts of the Alter Rebbe. And we can say that the year that this began was the year Tov Kuf Lamed Beis. The next thing that we'll be discussing is the year Tov Kuf Nun Beis, 1792. That year, 1792, was a very significant year in the history of Lubavitch and in the history of the Alter Rebbe. And that was the year, to the end of that year, that the Rebbetzin Dvorah Leah exchanged her life with the Alter Rebbe. But before we go on with this story, I think it would be appropriate at this point to make a little bit of a summary of everything we discussed up until now, just to go through the various dates in the history of the Alter Rebbe until we come up to the year Tov Kuf Nun Beis. Tov Kuf Hey, which is 1745, that is when the Alter Rebbe was born, in Chai Elul. 3 years later, Tavkuf Ches, 1748. That is when the Alter Rebbe had his first haircut, which is a significant time in any person's development. But with the Alter Rebbe, it was something very significant. This was the first time, and actually the only time, that the Alter Rebbe met face-to-face with the Baal Shem Tov. After that, he did not meet him again during the lifetime of the Baal Shem Tov. And the Alter Rebbe at the time wasn't told that it was Baal Shem Tov, but nevertheless, he did meet him. The next significant date is the Alter Rebbe's Bar Mitzvah. That was in the year Tavkuf Yud Ches. And during that Bar Mitzvah, which they celebrated a few days, the Ge'one Hader, the greatest Torah scholars of that generation, who attended the Bar Mitzvah, gave the Alter Rebbe the title Rav Tanahu Upolig, as we explained this before. The year Tavkuf Chof, that was the year of the Histalkus of the Baal Shem Tov. But that year, the Alter Rebbe got married on Yud Beis Menachem Av. And that was the time that the Alter Rebbe discovered that his teacher of Torah, Yisachar Ber, was actually a follower of the Baal Shem Tov, and that was the first time that he was exposed officially to the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. After the Alter Rebbe's wedding, that's also when the Alter Rebbe began a campaign, and he helped people physically, financially, that they should establish their source of income and their livelihood from working on the land, in farms or gardens and so on. Tavkuf Chav Daled, when the Alter Rebbe was approximately 19 years old, was the first time that he traveled to Mezrich. And that's when he became a chassid of the Mezrich Magid. And he stayed there until after Pesach, Tavkuf Chav Hei. Tavkuf Chav Zayin, which is 1767, that is when the Alter Rebbe became the head of the community of Lozhna. That's when he had the title, the Magid of Lozhna. Tavkuf Lamed, the Alter Rebbe was still a student of the Magid, but that is when he began writing the Shulchan Aruch. Tavkuf Lamed Beis, that is considered the year that Alter Rebbe began establishing the approach of Chassidus Chabad. And that is when the Alter Rebbe began his campaign that the Jews who lived in Vitebsk and those areas should move over beyond the border into Russia. Tavkuf Lamed Gimel is the year that the Mezrich Magid was installed. So in truth, it's also considered the year that Alter Rebbe became Rebbe. As we explained it before in detail, even though officially the Alter Rebbe accepted that position much later. But in reality, the Alter Rebbe became Rebbe instantly after the Mezrich Magid was Nistalik, and that was near Tavkuf Lamed Gimel, which is 1772. Also from that year, Tavkuf Lamed Gimel, until Tavkuf Lamed Ches, approximately for the next 5 years, that's when the Alter Rebbe established the yeshiva in Lozhna, which is known as the Tzli Chadorim, Cheder Aleph, Cheder Beis, and Cheder Gimel. The year Tavkuf Lamed Daled, 1774, was a very significant year. That was the year that Alter Rebbe traveled to Vilna to meet with the Vilna Gaon. He traveled together with Mendel Haradaka, and the Vilna Gaon refused to meet with them. Tavkuf Lamed Zayin, 1777, that is when Reb Mendel Haradaka and Reb Avram Kalisker and other Hasidic leaders and families traveled to Eretz Yisrael. They left Europe and went to Eretz Yisrael. And the Alter Rebbe traveled with them until the city of Moldiv. And then he made a decision that he's going to stay here in Russia and spread Chassidus in Russia and Lithuania. The year Tavkuf Mem Gimel, 1780, actually Tavkuf Mem Beis, 1782, is a significant year, and we'll discuss this later. That was the year that the Alter Rebbe began to orally give over the teachings of Tanya. In other words, Chassidus the Alter Rebbe taught all along, but specifically Tanya, he began in Tavkuf Mem Beis. In writing and in print, it came out later. But orally, the Alter Rebbe began to teach it in the year Tavkuf Mem Beis. Tavkuf Mem Ches, 1788. That was the year that Mendel Haradaka was nostalgic, and that year the Alter Rebbe officially accepted upon himself the title of becoming the Rebbe and the Nasi. Tavkuf Nun, this is when the Alter Rebbe repeated for the second time the teachings of Tanya orally. After completing it the first time, this was the second time around, as we'll explain this in the next lesson. Tavkuf Nun Aleph, 1791. That is when, by this time, the Alter Rebbe's writings, both in Nigla, in the revealed part of Torah, and in Chassidus, was well spread out in tremendous quantity throughout the country, throughout the Jewish Torah world. Tavkuf Nun Beis is where we're up to now. This is a very significant year, and the events that happened this year finally culminated with, at the end of the year and the beginning of Tavkuf Nun Gimel, with the passing of the Rebbetzin Dvar Aleya, when she exchanged her life for the life of the Alter Rebbe, and this enabled the Alter Rebbe to continue to teach Chassidus and spread Chassidus, as we'll explain this in the next lesson.